Well, whenever I have any family gatherings, my grandma greets us with the same greeting, my cousins and I. She says, "你胖了," which, if you're Chinese, means you've gotten fatter. She makes other observations like, your jacket's too tight. I don't really tell her that the new trend is to have tighter jackets, or that my head is shaped a little funny, and I don't tell her that my head shape is actually part of her genetics. But I also make observations about my grandma as well. She loves to save money, which I do as well. But here are some examples. My grandma, she reuses saran wrap over and over again. It's supposed to be used once, thrown away. She also uses paper towels as actual kitchen towels, so she'll dry them out and reuse them again. And most creative of all is that, actually, she actually also has all her Tupperware is Chinese takeout that she reuses and washes. But most creative of all that I've seen her do is she has, whenever she runs out of toothpaste in her toothpaste tube, she cuts open the back of the toothpaste. I just saw this the last time I was at home. And she scrapes out the rest of the toothpaste with her toothbrush. So she's really, really thrifty. And we all make observations in one form of another, some subconscious observations and some unconscious observations. I grew up in a non-traditional Chinese family. My father was a musician, and my mom was a journalist. My mom came to America originally with this dream to be a journalist, and like her father was a journalist, and she started in the mailroom, and eventually she ended up leading a 1,000-person news organization. And like most journalists, my mom was really, really good at making observations. My talk today is on the power of observation. I believe that if we make more frequent observations and we observe the right things, the world will be a place with more ideas, more empathy, and more joy. I have a 3-part framework to making observations. Look for problems, look for beauty, and look for lessons, and I'll just go through each one. So just starting with looking for problems. Over the last 4 years, I've worked with over 150 digital products for different startups and brands. Here are some of them, and one of the attributes that I find most common among both product owners and founders is their ability to quickly identify problems. In my own life, I keep notebooks of different problems that interest me, and you all may have different problems that interest you all, but my notebook is called Business Ideas. I'm a business person, so I love just finding problems and then thinking about how they relate with business ideas. So this is actually just an example of one of my notebooks. This is an actual screenshot from my notebook, so it's just ideas from the end of 2016 until more recent. But you can just see some of the problems that I deal with on a daily basis. One of them being, whenever I get on a flight, there's always a baby that's screaming on the flight. So I wrote down, create an instrument that allows babies' ears to be dealing with the pressure, because that's part of the reason why they're yelling. Or get rid of pigeons in outdoor restaurants. If you all have probably had an experience where you're outdoor enjoying a nice meal and a pigeon gets dangerously close to your foot. So it's like outdoor restaurants need to have some instrument for dealing with these pigeons. And there's other more serious things like how to revolutionize the credit score, which is a painful process. But if you all have issues finding problems, I start with this framework. I start with everyday items, like something like a toothbrush, and I'll say, toothbrushes, they're hugely wasteful of resources. You have to constantly throw them away and reuse them. You have to floss and brush your teeth. Everybody's mouth is a little bit different, and yet we all use a similar toothbrush. It's also hard to know when you're done brushing your teeth. You might brush your teeth for 30 seconds. Some people brush their teeth for 2 minutes, but when are you really done? Toilets is another example. I could go on and on about toilets. All of you probably have experienced something. Clogging, right? Everybody's clogged the toilet before and had an embarrassing situation. Maybe you were at a neighbor's house and you had to ask for a plumber. They waste tons and tons of water. Toilets haven't been innovated for a long time. They're dirty. If you're in a public toilet, you have to touch the the kind of handle to bring it up and down. And there are all sorts of issues that can be solved, but these are just kind of silly examples. I next think about more complex problems that need to be solved. These are issues that may be a little bit more nuanced, that may not have a direct answer. This could be a question like, what were American voters thinking when they voted for Trump, for example, or why does racism still exist today, or why do some neighborhoods or schools thrive while others don't? So really thinking through those problems. And then finally, I think through the deepest human problems, and that's problems that we as humans have struggled with since the beginning of time. What is the purpose of our lives? Where do we come from? What gives us true happiness and joy? Many of you have probably heard of William Wilberforce, who was one of the main legislative forces behind the abolishment of slavery in the UK. But most people probably haven't heard of Hannah More. She was a friend of William's, and she was a poet, a playwright. She was an early advocate for women's education, and she was an abolitionist as well. She wrote a poem called Slavery, which ended up being one of the key pieces behind legislation and key pieces that really turned the public tide towards the opposition of slavery. And one of the questions that I always ask myself, I guess even before that, the slave trade during the time was kind of one of the most heinous trades. If you think about UK slave owners would go, and other slave owners would go to Africa, they would kidnap people that were very healthy, and they would put them on these boats, and these boats that would travel from Africa to the UK, about half of the people would die on those boats. So that's how how poor the conditions were on the boat. And then secondly, there were slave owners that would throw their slaves overboard in an effort to collect on an insurance claim, so they were treated like property. So this was something that was very clearly wrong, but so few people spoke out against it. So, my question to ask is, why did she speak up, whereas so many others kept silent? And so the first thing that I mentioned was look for problems, but it's not enough to just look for problems. We need to find something that clashes with our values. So Hannah's value was that every person is made in the image of God and therefore valuable. And then she did something about it. And doing something about it is often the hardest thing, because when you do something that is against public opinion, you often face criticism, you face guilt and shame, and sometimes physical harm as well. So you have to be willing to do those things. So looking for problems is number one. Looking for beauty, number two. We live in this generation and culture that loves doing easy things. I, admittedly, after work, would love to just go home, sit on the couch, and watch Netflix, like maybe many of you. It's always easier to sort of disconnect. If you look at some of the biggest companies today, Google, Facebook, Apple, and Amazon, they deliver things quickly, which is why they're so valuable. And there's nothing wrong with efficiency and productivity and doing things fast, but sometimes it creates an association that everything should be fast and easy to get. And often the most beautiful things are complex, and they take time to appreciate and intentionality. Working in the technology industry, I see on-demand companies all the time. Some of you are familiar with Uber and Airbnb, some of the biggest on-demand companies, but there are hundreds of on-demand companies. I hear the most random ideas that you wouldn't believe that people are coming up with. There's on-demand dog walking, on-demand babysitting, on-demand, you name it, they have it. So in this generation, it's even more difficult to take the time to say, complex things are not necessarily complex, but things that are rich and sometimes take time to process. Some of those things are the most beautiful things. An article in The Atlantic came out more recently that showed that post-iPhone, high schoolers are getting their licenses later and later, and they're hanging out with their friends less and less in person. And really showing that people are using social media to interact with each other, but they're not necessarily talking with each other face-to-face anymore. One of the quotes that I find sums this up very well is a quote by one of my favorite pastors, and he says, "Raking is easy, but all you get is leaves. Digging is hard, but you might find gold." Beautiful things take effort and time, and I urge you all to kind of look for, watch a critically acclaimed movie, even though if it's hard to understand, watch it over and over and ask yourself, why is it Why is this critically acclaimed? Read a long-form book or article that has stood the test of time. I find that some of the things that have lasted throughout time, those things have competed against millions of other things, and therefore, they stood the test of time and are, extremely beautiful. Or go to a park and listen to the sounds. Something as simple as photosynthesis, which many of you know. A plant takes in water and carbon dioxide and then sunlight and then produces glucose, which is food for itself, and then oxygen, which we breathe in. It's a miracle that's happening all around us, and we kind of take these things for granted because we just see it all the time and we don't think much about it. So take the time to process these things. When I was a kid, this is me. When I was a kid, my dad used to force me to listen to classical music. He would take us to classical concerts. He would play classical music in the car and at home. And my brother and I, we loved rock. We loved Coldplay and U2 and Radiohead and some of these, rock artists. And we hated it when my dad would take us to these classical concerts. But now, growing up, I realized that there's so much richness in classical masterpieces. You can listen to them over and over again, and they don't get old, whereas a pop song may be cliche, and you listen to it 10 times in a day, and it gets boring. Try listening to a piece of Chopin or Beethoven, turn off the lights, and think about a problem that you're dealing with and see how classical music can speak to that. Look for problems, look for beauty, and finally, look for lessons. Lessons you can find anywhere, even in the things that people view there to be no lessons in at all. Make learning lessons a game. After every class you're in, figure out what the takeaway is. If you fail at something, figure out why you failed at it and how you can do better the next time. If you see like a business failing or something like that, ask why the business failed and try to figure out the solution yourself. When I was in high school, I really had two interests, sports or basketball and playing computer games. There are so many lessons I feel like that can be learned from these two things, but most people at the time had told me stop doing these things because they take away time from more valuable activities like doing your schoolwork or whatever it is. But just to give you an example of some of the different things I've learned, this is me in middle school playing computers. So for computer games, obviously I'm a technologist today. There's no coincidence that I'm pretty good with computers, and a lot of that has to do with me playing games, frankly. I also managed a team at a very young age, and our team became one of the top 5 Warcraft teams in the United States. And I learned how to be strategic and come up with counter strategies. And then finally, I found shortcuts to things in gaming. If you're 2 or 3 seconds behind someone, then that could cost you a win or a loss. And there have been more profound lessons that I learned in basketball. This is me at the Staples Center, with my Wizards jersey on. And some of the best lessons I've learned have been in basketball. So, for example, I come from D.C. and I follow the Wizards. If you're an NBA fan, you know that the Wizards are horrible. Over the last 30 years, we have the second worst record cumulatively in that period of time. And so I grew up really needing to learn the lessons of faithfulness and patience. My pastor said at my wedding that he knew that I would be a faithful husband because I was a Wizards fan. It was painful growing up. It was always a lost overtime, a missed call. Something always went wrong. But it taught me that some of my greatest joys came from following this painful team and having association with friends. Secondly, encouragement. Home court advantage is one of the most valuable statistics that is used nowadays. Home court advantage, the same team that plays at home has a much better chance than the team that plays away, and the main difference is someone cheering for them. My parents growing up always told me that I could do anything that I really set my heart to and worked hard at, and that allowed me to go from really a high school student that wasn't really good at getting good grades to a gamer to a hedge fund manager to running a nonprofit to now having a technology company, a foundation, and a real estate company. Finally, one more thing on sports. It also taught me the value of adoration. It's one of those things where if you've gone to a sports game, the excitement of scoring a goal or a basket, you see strangers hugging each other and giving each other high fives. There's people from different socioeconomic classes, different races, all together being part of this greater picture. And Ayn Rand, the novelist, once said, Adoration is one of the greatest human desires. We like to be part of this bigger picture, and it's the same thing in music. When you go to a concert, you're euphoric because you're part of this bigger picture and unified with other people. Oscar Wilde had a quote that said, "The public have the insatiable curiosity to know everything except for what is worth knowing." It turns out in the information age, there's lots and lots of information, but we don't always observe the right things. It's not always about knowing everything if you want to make a difference in the world. It's about knowing the valuable things and being willing to live and die for those things. My wife and I, in 2014, we moved to South Central Los Angeles, which many people know as the home of the Crips and Bloods, or two of the most famous gangs in the US. And we moved there because as Christians, Jesus spent time with those that faced injustices and that have been marginalized by society. That was a problem that we were extremely passionate about, and we moved in order to do that. A lot of people, when we first moved, told us that we were crazy, that it was too dangerous, that the people there came from too big of a background difference than us. But we found the opposite to be true. We learned about the problems of systemic racism in America. We learned about the joy and beauty of long-term community, and we learned lessons from people with a different perspective than us. It's estimated today that there are over 30 million slaves, and this is a huge problem. There are so many problems today that need light to be shed on. And I'm just going to read a poem off the screen that and you guys can follow it along, that I mentioned previously that Hannah had wrote called Slavery to close out. Thy followers only have effaced the shame inscribed by slavery on the Christian name. Shall Britain, where the soul of freedom reigns, forge change for others she herself disdains. Forbid heaven, oh let the nations know, the liberty she tastes she will bestow. Not to herself the glorious gift confined, she spreads the blessing wide as humankind, and scorning narrow views of time and place, bids all be free in earth's extended space. What page of human annals can record a deed so bright as human rights restored? Oh, may that godlike deed, that shining page, redeem our fame and consecrate our age. Use observation as a tool to shed light in darkness. Find a problem that you're passionate about. Find beauty that can inspire you to action, and learn a lesson in every circumstance. Thank you.